Porter Halyburton is a Vietnam War veteran who piloted aircraft for the U.S. Navy during the war. In 1965, after flying 75 combat missions, he was shot down by North Vietnamese forces. At the age of 24, he was captured and imprisoned, including in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp, where captured servicemen were often tortured and interrogated. Halyburton was released in February 1973 as part of Operation Homecoming. After retiring from the Navy as a commander in 1984, he worked as a professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. Okay, so you grew up in a really small town in North Carolina, obviously,
Yes.
Davidson. And so to what extent was that kind of a military town? And how did your family feel about your involvement in the military as well as going to Vietnam?
Well, it wasn't a military town at all, except for ROTC, which was at the time mandatory for the Davidson College students. And it was an all-male college at the time. And so everybody had to take ROTC. But that was about the extent of any military involvement, although they had done things during World War II to support the war effort there. But it was a college town, you know, with a few little mills and things like that, stores.
Okay, yeah. So in your speech there, you talked about how, you know, communism was really the threat at the time,
Right.
and it was portrayed. So to what extent was politics what extent did that play a role in your decision to go to Vietnam?
Well, I thought, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're trying to oppose the communists and their spread. And you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Sherman-Williams paint, but one of their sort of logos was a world with a can of red paint, and the red paint is beginning to cover the whole world. And so that was kind of the Sherman-Williams theory of the spread of communism, that it was, if you don't stop them somewhere, it will never cease, and they will eventually take over everything. And so that became the thing that that motivated our foreign policy and everything in the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan and other things after World War II, was specifically to oppose communism, because de Gaulle was saying, you know, we might go communist if you don't help us, and that kind of thing. So, and one of the helps was to let them go back to their colonies, which was a huge mistake, because FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president during World War II, he said that we're not just fighting against the Nazis and the Japanese, the fascists. We are fighting to end colonialism, because he saw colonialism as the root of almost all conflicts. But he died. Truman took over, and that was, of course, our number one ally was Great Britain, and they were the number one colonial power as well. So it was hard to do.
So then, like looking back on it now, obviously we get a different perspective with history today. So would you still kind of agree that communism was such a big threat, and would you still kind of, even with revision today, would you still say that it was the right decision?
Well, in a way, yes. It was proven that maybe the domino theory, you know, which was if Vietnam falls, then Laos will, and Cambodia, and on and on. And so we had to stop them here. We had to stop the dominoes from falling. And I'm not sure that that was the case, but I am sure that the Soviet Union, and then later in 1949, the Chinese were determined, you know, to try and control most of the world, because if they could control it all, then, you know, they had it all. And so it was very definitely this Cold War against the West, against primarily the East, and so on. And I understand now that, you know, communism had the seeds of its own destruction in it, because of the old adage of, you know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this happened. You know, they were not immune to this. And so, you know, Lenin, Stalin, Kosygin, and all of those, and Mao Zedong, you know, they achieved this power, and they were determined to hang on to it, not let the state wither away as communism was supposed to do. So in a way, communism was never going to succeed.
Okay, yeah. And so in your speech as well, you talked a little bit about how when you were shot down in that moment, it was kind of a scary moment, and you had a split-second decision to make a choice. So can you just tell me, like, what ran through your head? What was kind of, were you focused more on survival? Was it like an instinctual decision, or?
Well, I mean, I had very few seconds to think about this, but a lot went through my mind at the time. And the first was, do I eject from this airplane, or do I go into the mountain with it? Because I'd never really considered being a prisoner of war. I had considered, okay, we could very easily be killed doing this. It's a dangerous thing. I mean, there was flak everywhere and all this. And I think, because I left wife and newborn daughter at home, I was determined to survive for them. I didn't want to leave them fatherless. I had grown up without a father. And so that was a primary, I think, motivation. And I said, well, I'm gonna give it a try, see what it's like.
All right, so then, you were captured, obviously. How were those opening months, particularly? You talked a little bit about that, but how were they?
Well, in a way, the first part of the experience is always the worst, and because you weren't adjusted to that situation yet. And we found over time that you could mentally and physically adjust to almost anything. It took time, though. It took time and determination. And so you had the determination, but before you had the time for your physically to adjust to things, it was pretty tough, because you had absolutely nothing except these few little things, and you had to learn to live within those and within the confines of the prison and the rules and all of that. So it was a very tough adjustment. And so you were very optimistic that the war was going to be over soon, because you didn't think you could survive for very long. But the longer you were there, the better you adjusted, the longer you realized you could survive. And so at the very end of the war, I said, I hope we go home soon, but if not, I'm mentally, physically, spiritually prepared to stay here another 10 years. Or forever if I had to, I didn't want to, but.
And so, yeah, you talked about your relationship with Fred Cherry being extremely important to kind of reorienting yourself to a purpose. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? What was that like?
Well, as I said, that, prior to that, my two things were to do my duty and to survive, physically survive, mentally survive as well. And so that was it. That was really it. And I communicated with others, because that's what we were supposed to do, and you wanted to, to speak with other Americans and so on. But I don't think that I realized the vital nature of communication as a way to care for others, And so living with Fred and taking care of him, I realized that I had to take care of Fred, but at the same time, we all had to take care of each other. And so we did construct a military organization, which emerged from the war as the 4th Allied POW Wing. We also emerged as a family. And there were so many people there I had never laid eyes on. I hadn't lived with them, I hadn't talked to them, but we all accumulated information about each other. And I memorized everybody's name, 350 names, up till 1968, when the bombing stopped and we stopped getting people there. There were 350 of us. And I memorized everybody's, not just their name, but their name in chronological order of when they were shot down and captured. I memorized the type of airplane they were flying, their rank and service, anything I could know about them that I could attach to that name. And so that became a mission, was to retain these 350 names. And so I would go over them every day. I had them memorized in five different ways, rank and service, shoot down date, alphabetically, and so on. And so that became a mission, because if I could escape or get word to somebody, I could get these names out. And so if I was living with somebody else, we would go over these names every day. And anytime I lived with somebody new or I was in contact with them, I would go through the names and see if they had any additions or corrections or anything like that. So it was that sense, that kind of effort that created this family, And so there are guys that I never laid eyes on until we came home, but I still knew a lot about them, and in a way loved everybody and cared for them.
So so you've met so many new people, and you're from North Carolina, obviously.
Right.
Like, what was it like meeting so many people from across the U.S. and maybe from different areas as well? I mean, it must have been very nice.
That was wonderful, because you had access to all kinds of different experiences. I lived with Air Force people, so I learned a lot about the Air Force I didn't know. There were a lot of different aircraft that were flown, and I learned about them as well. The differences between the Navy and the Air Force, and a few Army and so on. So it was learning, from each other was so important. And so we tried to learn if some guy knew how to grow tomatoes, that's what we learned. Yeah.
And so how well did you stay in contact with them after you were released?
Well, some people have not wanted to continue the relationship for a variety of reasons. We have an official organization, NAMPOW, and we have a listserv, and we can exchange information and things, and discussions and things like that. We used to have a newsletter, and now it's online kind of thing. So anytime somebody is sick or dies, that information is put out. And I don't know how many people are actually on the listserv, but it has to be maybe a couple of hundred anyway. And so our numbers are diminishing. The guys who are older, I'm 78 years old, and a lot of people were 10, 15 years older than I was.
So I believe you stated before that the anti-war movement was, like you said it as well, that it was kind of an enemy, that it worked to prolong the war. It was how the Vietnamese were able to win in the end. So kind of what was that general feeling like in Vietnam among soldiers and towards the movement, and have you changed your mind since?
Well, yes, I have changed my mind. And yes, at the time, we grew to view the anti-war movement as an enemy, because these were people that were protesting against the war. And see, we thought, if everybody supported the war, it would be over sooner. I'm not sure that was true, but so, and things had changed. The hippies, had long hair and all these things that military people just, they kind of anathema. We grew to look at the anti-war movement as another enemy, another force that was going to prolong the war and thus prolong our stay there. And so they wanted us to become part of that anti-war movement, and so that solidified our thoughts about that, And people like Jane Fonda and all that, who actively supported the enemy. We felt they were traitors, and there were people burning their draft cards and all kinds of things like that, refusing to serve their nation. And so I maintained that attitude, for quite a while. But I also understand that there were very legitimate reasons for protesting the war, and I think the people who protested against the war because they didn't want to go, they were afraid, is one thing. But there were other people who legitimately felt that this was the wrong war, and that we were doing things that should be opposed. And I agree with that. And so, in a way, I've changed. If I know now, if I knew then what I know now, I would undoubtedly be against the war, and thus anti-war. So.
And then one final question: what was it like going back to the Hanoi Hilton?
I was shot down on October the 17th, and it took 2 days to get from where I was to Hanoi, and so I arrived on October the 19th, 1965, and a couple of guys had put together a return trip to Vietnam. And I'd been asked any number of times, do you want to go back to Vietnam? No, I want to go to Paris. I want to go, all these other places. But this trip was leaving on October the 17th, getting to Hanoi on October the 19th. And there were a bunch of my friends that were going to go. And so finally I said, yes, I'll go. And my wife wanted to go. And so 25 years later, in 1998, we went back for the first time. And of course, we visited prisons and we toured around. And I had seen very little of Vietnam, really, except from the air and from the inside of prison cells. So it was all, after we tried to find the location of where our plane had crashed and Stan Olmsted had died unsuccessfully. After that, it became really just touring the country and learning about it and all of that. And the most surprising thing was that we were welcomed, and my wife would say, don't you know what these guys did? They bombed your country and so on. That was a long time ago, and we moved on. We've forgotten about that because the government wants to keep that alive, but the people don't necessarily. They're enjoying the longest period of peace and relative prosperity that they have in a couple of thousand years. And so I think they're grateful, and so we have established relations with them, diplomatic relations, and become friends and so on. We look to Vietnam as an ally against China and so on. So it's kind of come full circle there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, my pleasure.